Most people think the military keeps secrets to protect the country. That's not always true. Some things are kept quiet because once people understand them, the entire structure of authority starts to look different. I didn't understand that when I was young. Back then, I was just following orders. My name is Richard J. Wolfe. I served in the United States Air Force. Not in any role you'd recognize from recruitment posters or public records. The kind of assignments I had rarely appear on paper, and when they do, they're buried under language so neutral it erases the truth. For most of my career, I didn't ask questions. That wasn't courage, it was survival. In the Air Force, especially in certain units, curiosity can be treated like insubordination. You learn quickly that the safest soldier is the one who does what he's told and leaves the thinking to someone higher up the chain. That's how the system works, and that's how I ended up witnessing something that was never supposed to become a memory. It happened during a deployment that, officially speaking, never involved anything unusual. If you checked the paperwork, it would read like a routine field operation. Equipment transport, environmental monitoring, a few routine patrol rotations, nothing remarkable. But there was a protocol attached to that mission, a protocol none of us had ever been trained for, at least not openly. The first sign something was different came from the briefing. It wasn't the room, not the officers, not the slides on the screen. It was the language. Military briefings usually explain procedures in practical terms. What to do, where to go, what the objective is. Even when information is classified, there's still a logical structure. That day there wasn't. The officer delivering the briefing avoided specifics. He repeated the same instructions several times. If an encounter occurs, you will activate the secondary containment protocol. Not what the encounter was, not what we were containing, just the protocol. Someone in the room asked the obvious question. "Encounter with what, sir?" The officer paused, not the kind of pause you make when you're searching for words, the kind you make when the words already exist but you're not allowed to say them. Finally, he answered, "You'll recognize it." That was the entire explanation. No diagrams, no descriptions, just that sentence. You'll recognize it. At the time, I assumed it was some kind of biological hazard, maybe experimental equipment, maybe a crash recovery scenario involving classified technology. The military deals with strange things all the time. But there was something else about that briefing, a second layer of instructions about silence. If the protocol was activated, we were told, communication would shift immediately to restricted channels. Personal notes were forbidden. Field reports would be dictated through designated officers only. And one line stayed with me. I remember it exactly. Personnel involved in visual contact will not discuss observations outside debriefing clearance. Not should not recommended not to, will not. There's a difference between those phrases. One is guidance, the other is expectation backed by consequences. Still, most of us in that room treated it like another strange but manageable directive. Military life is full of procedures that don't make sense until later. Sometimes they never make sense at all. We were told the protocol had been written decades earlier. No explanation why. No explanation how often it had been used, just that it existed, and that if we encountered what it referred to, we would know. At that moment, sitting in that briefing room, I believed them. I believed the system knew what it was doing. I believed someone, somewhere, understood the full picture. What I didn't understand yet was something far more unsettling. The protocol wasn't written to explain the encounter. It was written to control the people who witnessed it. And that distinction only became clear the night the protocol was activated. The night we saw something that didn't belong to any country on Earth or any species we recognized. I remember the moment very clearly, not because it was dramatic, but because of how quiet everything suddenly became. And the first thought that crossed my mind wasn't fear, it was something much stranger. Because the officer had been right. The second we saw it, we recognized it. And that realization still bothers me, because no one had ever told us what we were supposed to recognize. So how did we know? And why had the protocol been waiting for that moment, long before any of us were even born? There's a moment in every soldier's life when training stops feeling theoretical. You can read procedures 100 times, memorize every step, run drills until your muscles move automatically. But the first time something real happens, the room changes, the air changes. That night the change was almost physical. We were operating in a remote sector, far from anything that could be called civilization. The kind of terrain where sound travels strangely, and the sky looks larger than it does anywhere else. I'd been on enough deployments to know the rhythm of night patrols. He learned the noises, the patterns, the way the wind moves through dry ground. What happened didn't follow any of those patterns. At first it looked like a distant light, not bright, not dramatic, just something out of place against the horizon. One of the guys beside me noticed it before I did. He nudged my shoulder and pointed. We stood there watching it for a few seconds. Military training teaches you to analyze things quickly. Aircraft, satellites, flares, most aerial lights have recognizable movement. They follow trajectories, angles, speeds. This didn't. It drifted. That's the closest word I can find even now. Not flying, not falling, drifting. Then it stopped. Not slowed down, stopped. Perfectly still in midair. I remember feeling something in my stomach at that moment. Not panic, more like the quiet realization that the situation had just moved outside the range of normal explanations. Someone called it in over the radio. The response came faster than expected. Maintain visual, do not approach. Those were the first words. Then, after a pause that lasted maybe 2 seconds, prepare secondary containment protocol. You don't forget a sentence like that when you've only heard it once before in a briefing room. The moment those words came through the radio, everyone in our unit looked at each other. No one said anything, but we all understood the same thing at the same time. The protocol was real. The light moved again, slowly, descending, and when it came low enough for us to see its shape clearly, I felt something I still struggle to describe. Because the object didn't look mechanical in the way aircraft look mechanical. There were no visible seams, no rivets, no wings. It was smooth, almost too smooth for something that large. A curved structure reflecting the faint glow of our equipment lights. Not metallic exactly, more like a surface that absorbed and softened light instead of reflecting it sharply. Someone behind me whispered something under his breath. I don't remember the words. What I remember is the silence that followed. The object settled on the ground maybe 50 yards away. No impact, no dust cloud. It just arrived. And then something happened that changed the entire atmosphere of that night. A section of the structure opened, not with hinges, not with any visible mechanism. The surface simply separated, as if the material itself had decided to move. This is a part people usually expect me to describe with excitement. But the truth is, the emotion in that moment wasn't excitement. It was restraint. Because the protocol had already taken control of the situation. The team leader gave the command. Containment positions. Every one of us moved automatically. Equipment cases opened. Protective gear came out. Devices none of us had ever used before were suddenly being assembled as if we'd trained with them our whole careers. That's when I realized something disturbing. Even though we had never practiced the protocol openly, our bodies already knew the sequence. Someone had trained us, somewhere, in ways we didn't consciously remember. And then we saw it, the figure emerging from the opening. It was smaller than I expected, thin, balanced in a way that looked almost fragile. but at the same time completely stable. Its movements were slow, controlled, deliberate. It stepped onto the ground and paused, just stood there, not approaching, not retreating, observing. I've heard people describe non-human entities in exaggerated ways. Movies tend to distort the image so much that the real experience gets lost. What I saw wasn't monstrous. It wasn't dramatic. It was unfamiliar. That's the most accurate word. Unfamiliar in the way a species from a completely different branch of life might appear. The head proportion was slightly larger than ours, the limbs long but not awkward, the posture upright, almost careful, as if it understood gravity but wasn't entirely used to the way it worked here. No visible equipment, no obvious threat, just presence. And that's when the second stage of the protocol began. The command came over the radio again, a different voice this time, calm, controlled. Do not initiate communication. That line still echoes in my head. Not be cautious, not observe carefully, just a direct instruction. Do not initiate communication. Which raises a question I've carried for decades. Why would the first instinct of a protocol be silence when faced with something intelligent? Unless the purpose of the protocol was never contact. Unless the purpose was control. Control of the situation. Control of the witnesses. Control of what would eventually be remembered. Because the moment that entity stepped onto the ground, every single one of us knew something else. Something no briefing had ever prepared us for. The thing standing 50 yards away from us was looking directly at us. Not scanning the environment, not wandering in confusion, looking at us, as if it had expected us to be there. And the most unsettling thought didn't arrive until much later, years later actually, when I finally asked myself something no soldier is encouraged to ask. What if the protocol we activated that night wasn't designed for their arrival? What if it existed because someone already knew they would come? People imagine encounters like that turning chaotic. Weapons raised, shouting, panic. That's not how it happened. The strangest part of that night was how controlled everything felt. Almost rehearsed. When the command came to initiate containment positions, none of us hesitated. Our team leader began assigning placements without even looking at his notes. Equipment was deployed in a semicircle around the landing site. Portable emitters were positioned on the ground, each one spaced with precise distance between them. We didn't know what the devices did. We only knew where they were supposed to go. That's how most classified operations work. You're trained for the procedure, not the explanation. I carried one of the emitters myself. It was heavier than it looked. Smooth casing, no labels, no markings that would suggest a manufacturer. The kind of hardware that never appears in procurement catalogs. When I set it down in the dirt, a faint vibration moved through the casing. Not loud, just enough to feel through the gloves. Someone behind me asked quietly over the headset, "What exactly are these things doing?" No answer came. Instead, the command channel repeated a single instruction. Maintain formation. Avoid eye fixation. That last part caught my attention. Avoid eye fixation. Not maintain distance. Not avoid contact. Avoid eye fixation. At the time, I didn't understand why, but I obeyed, like everyone else. The entity was still standing where it had first stepped out, not moving aggressively, not approaching, just watching. The longer you looked at it, the more something about its stillness began to feel unnatural. Humans shift weight without noticing. Even when we stand still, our bodies make small adjustments. It didn't. Its posture remained perfectly balanced, as if gravity affected it differently. Then one of the emitters activated. A low hum rolled across the ground. Not loud enough to echo, but deep enough that I could feel it through my boots. One by one, the other devices joined in. Within seconds, the entire semicircle was producing the same vibration. The air between us and the craft began to distort slightly. Not visibly like heat waves, but something subtle changed in the way sound carried. My headset audio thinned out for a moment, like the frequency had shifted. The entity reacted, not violently, just a slight tilt of the head. That was the first movement it made since stepping onto the ground. And it looked curious. That's the word that stuck with me. Curious. As if it was observing the field we had created and trying to understand its purpose. Then the voice returned over the command channel. Visual confirmation acknowledged. Stage 3 containment. Stage 3. None of us had heard that phrase in the briefing. Still, the team leader knew exactly what it meant. He gave the order for us to step back 2 paces in perfect synchronization. The emitters intensified their vibration, the hum dropping into a lower frequency that I could feel inside my chest. The entity shifted again, not retreating, not advancing, just adjusting its stance slightly, like someone testing their balance on unfamiliar ground. And that's when the realization started creeping into my mind. The field we had created wasn't designed to capture it. It wasn't restraining it. There were no barriers, no visible reaction from the craft itself, no attempt by the entity to escape. The field was centered outward, on us. That's when I understood something none of us had been told. The containment protocol wasn't containing the entity. It was containing the soldiers. Our movement range had been carefully limited by the device placement, our line of sight directed away from prolonged observation. Even the headset frequencies had been modified to reduce certain kinds of audio interference. The system wasn't protecting us from it. The system was controlling how we experienced it. Later, during debriefing, I would realize something else. Not one of our field reports described the entity in the same level of detail. Some of the guys remembered the limbs being longer. Others insisted the skin tone looked different. One soldier claimed the head shape was more angular than the rest of us recalled. At the time, I assumed it was just stress affecting memory. But years later, thinking back on those emitters, the frequencies, the instructions to avoid eye fixation, I began to wonder, what if the protocol wasn't just controlling our positions? What if it was controlling perception? Because memory is a fragile thing in moments like that. The brain tries to organize unfamiliar information into patterns it already understands. And if someone knew how to influence that process, they wouldn't need to erase what we saw. They would only need to make sure none of us remembered it exactly the same way. The entity stood there for maybe 4 minutes, maybe 5. Time stretches in strange ways when something impossible is standing in front of you. Eventually it turned, not toward us, toward the craft. It walked back the same way it had come, slow and deliberate, stepping across the ground like someone navigating a surface that still felt unfamiliar. The opening in the structure closed behind it, again without hinges, again without visible mechanism. The craft lifted from the ground almost silently, not rapidly, just a smooth upward movement. Within seconds it was back above the horizon line where we had first seen it. And then the light faded, gone. No sonic boom, no trail, nothing. The hum from the emitters stopped immediately after. The command channel came alive again. Protocol complete. Await retrieval team. No celebration, no explanation, just another instruction. We stood there in the quiet desert for several minutes after that. No one spoke. I remember looking around at the faces of the men beside me. Every one of them had the same expression. Not fear, not excitement, something heavier. The look people have when they realize the world is larger than they were ever told. But that realization didn't last long, because the real purpose of the protocol revealed itself during the hours that followed, not out in the field, but in the room where they brought us afterward, the room where every witness learns the same lesson. Seeing something extraordinary doesn't mean you're allowed to understand it. And sometimes the most important part of a secret operation is making sure the people who were there start questioning their own memory. Even now, decades later, I can still picture that room, the chairs, the lighting, the officer who conducted the debrief, and the first sentence he said when we sat down, a sentence that made it clear the encounter itself wasn't the main concern. The main concern was us. Because before anyone asked what we saw, they asked something else, something I didn't understand until much later. They asked us what we thought we saw, and that difference turned out to be the most important part of the entire protocol. Most people assume the dangerous part of an encounter happens in the field, out there in the dark, facing something unknown. That's not where the real control begins. The real control starts afterward, when the witnesses are alone in a room with people who already know exactly what they want those witnesses to remember. They transported us back to base before sunrise. No conversation during the ride. No speculation allowed over comms. The silence felt procedural, like another part of the protocol. By the time we arrived, the retrieval team was already waiting. Not scientists, not investigators, officers, the kind who rarely introduce themselves. We were separated almost immediately. That's another detail people overlook when they imagine events like this. Isolation is one of the oldest psychological tools in the military. Separate the witnesses and you separate the story. When you can't compare notes, certainty starts to dissolve. I was placed in a small briefing room, plain table, 2 chairs, a recorder sitting in the center like it had been there long before I walked in. An officer entered a few minutes later, older than most commanders I'd served under, calm posture, no visible rank insignia beyond the bare minimum. He sat down across from me and studied my face for a moment, not aggressively, almost patiently. Then he said something I still remember word for word. "Airman Wolf, we're not here to discuss facts. We're here to discuss interpretation." That sentence confused me more than the encounter itself. In the military, facts are everything. Position, time, sequence. If something happens in the field, the report is supposed to describe it exactly as it occurred. But that wasn't what he wanted. He asked me to describe what I thought I had seen, not what I had seen. What I thought I had seen. At the time, the distinction felt small. Now I understand it was the entire purpose of the conversation. Because when people describe what they think they saw, they start filling gaps. The mind adds explanations, assumptions, doubts. The officer listened carefully while I spoke. Occasionally he nodded. Occasionally he asked small clarifying questions. Never once did he say the word entity. Never once did he refer to the craft. Everything was framed in neutral language. Object, figure, movement. By the time I finished my statement, something strange had happened. My memory already felt less solid than it had when I first walked into the room. That's how suggestion works. Not through force, but through careful redirection. Then he asked me a final question. "Do you believe what you observed represents a confirmed biological organism?" Not was it. Do you believe? I hesitated, because belief is a dangerous word in environments built on certainty. "I don't know, sir," I said, and he smiled slightly, not with amusement, with approval. "That's the correct position." He turned off the recorder. Then he explained something that stayed classified for the rest of my career. The containment protocol had never been designed solely for the entity. It was designed for the observers. For decades, certain encounters had produced the same pattern among soldiers who witnessed them. Confusion, obsession, the need to understand something that had no immediate explanation. Those reactions were considered operational risks. So the protocol did 3 things. First, it structured the environment so witnesses could only observe from controlled positions. Second, it used specific frequencies and instructions to reduce prolonged fixation. And third, it shaped the memory during debriefing, not by erasing anything, just by introducing enough uncertainty that no two accounts would ever align perfectly. When multiple witnesses remember the same event differently, the story loses its power. Disagreement weakens credibility. Credibility determines whether something becomes history or rumor. That was the logic. I sat there listening to him explain all this, realizing something slowly. The military didn't just control classified information. It controlled the confidence of the people who experienced it. Because doubt is a stronger barrier than secrecy. If you're not sure what you saw, you hesitate to speak. And if you do speak, people hear uncertainty instead of testimony. Before I left the room, the officer gave one final instruction. Airman Wolf, what you experienced tonight is not something the public is equipped to contextualize. Your responsibility is to continue your service and allow the appropriate departments to manage the implications. That was it. No threats, no dramatic warnings, just the quiet expectation of obedience. And for decades, that's exactly what I gave them. I continued serving. I followed orders. I kept silent. Not because I was afraid of punishment, but because the protocol had worked exactly as intended. It made me question my own memory. It made every witness question theirs. And once doubt settles in, silence becomes easy. But age changes the way you look at things. Time has a way of stripping authority down to its simplest form. I'm not a young airman anymore. I'm an old man who has had decades to think about a single question. Not what I saw. I know what I saw. The question that never left me is something else entirely. If the military created a protocol to control the perception of encounters like that, then how many times had it already been used before my unit ever activated it? How many witnesses had stood where I stood? How many debriefing rooms had that same conversation? And the question that still keeps me awake some nights, was the protocol written because encounters happen occasionally, or because someone already knew they would keep happening? I spent most of my life believing I was protecting a secret. Now I'm not sure that's true, because sometimes the most powerful secret isn't the existence of something unknown. It's the system built to make sure no one ever feels certain about it. And if you're listening to me now, decades later, there's something I want you to consider. Not whether I'm telling the truth, not whether you believe this story. Ask yourself something simpler. If a government wanted to hide encounters with something not human, wouldn't the most effective method be making sure the witnesses themselves were never completely sure of what they saw? Because I was there. I followed the protocol. I sat in the room afterward. And even now, after all these years, there's one detail from that night I still can't answer with complete certainty. When the entity looked at us across that field, was it studying the soldiers? Or was it studying the system built to control them?